My name is Sara Vero and I'm a PhD student here at NUI Galway, and I'm doing my PhD in collaboration with Teagasc Environmental Research Centre in Johnstown Castle in Wexford. My supervisors here at NUI Galway are Drs Mark Healy and Tiernan Henry, and my primary Teagasc supervisor is Dr Owen Fenton.
Great. You work with groundwater. So my first question for you is, what is groundwater?
Well, groundwater is the water which is stored in cracks and pores of the bedrock. And it's actually where we get a lot of our drinking water. In Ireland, 26% of drinking water is abstracted from groundwater. And in rural areas like Roscommon, it can be as high as 75%. It's really an important resource. It's estimated that there are some 200,000 groundwater wells across Ireland. Roughly half of that number are anticipated to be in use. It's really interesting. It's one of the largest available sources of fresh water. Much of the Earth's water is either saline or trapped in ice, but we often forget about this hidden reserve.
Yeah, I don't think people would realise that much of our drinking water comes from the ground.
No, absolutely not.
What is the general status of Ireland's groundwater?
Well, actually, to start with, we're doing pretty well compared to many other countries. The European Union has set threshold concentrations for various chemicals in water. So long as our water is below these threshold chemical concentrations, we consider our water good. And obviously you have to have enough water, but that's never really going to be a problem in Ireland, well, without serious climate change. So for example, nitrogen is a serious contaminant, and we can have up to 11.3 milligrams per litre of nitrogen, above which we no longer consider water potable or clean. And we call this the MAC, which stands for the maximal allowable concentration. And these values were set for the EPA for 40 different chemicals.
Why should we care if our water is dirty, if these thresholds are exceeded or not? As you say, it's beneath the ground. We can't really see it. We've got lots of water falling from the sky anyway.
Over 85% of our groundwaters are achieving good status as per the EU regulations. But there are two issues with clean water. Number one, obviously we need it to drink, and it's not good enough to say that you can never have enough quality. You always want, if we have 85% good water quality now, what can we do to get 95% and then 100%? But as well as that, there's a legislative issue. The EU Water Framework Directive was enacted in December 2000, and it states that all water bodies must achieve good status within set reporting periods, and the first reporting period is 2015. If you fail to achieve these quality standards, there could be repercussions in terms of penalties. Now, regarding the waters that are poor status, it seems likely, based on preliminary simulations, some of them my supervisor Owen Fenton, some of them done by Roger Schulte at Teagasc Johnstown Castle, that many water bodies in Ireland cannot achieve these deadlines. And the reason they can't achieve it is because there's already chemicals present in the soil above the groundwater. We typically forget about the soil as well. It's so ubiquitous, we don't think of it. But these chemicals are very slowly leaching into the groundwater, and so they may cause a prolonged increased chemical concentration above the required level that we can't actually do anything about because the chemical is already there. We have to wait for it to flush out. And we call this intrinsic delay, we call this time lag.
So for Ireland's groundwater that is of poor status rating at the moment, has this problem mostly come through the soil?
Yeah, it comes through the soil. Actually, you can have point and non-point source pollution. So point source pollution is, say, if a pipe was leaking directly, a dirty water pipe was leaking directly into a river. But I'm concerned with non-point source agricultural pollution. You see, we apply fertilisers to the top of the soil in order to increase agricultural productivity. And these are the primary source of contamination of groundwater in Ireland. Basically, you have nitrogen and phosphorus, and these are key for plant growth. However, if you have them in excessive plant growth, they're available to move through the soil. If they get to the water, they can cause eutrophication, which you might be familiar with, the very dramatic algal blooms you can see in water, and that will choke out other life. So that's the major issue we have, and we're trying to offset it, prevent it, and then mitigate what's already in place.
Do you think then, you said, what's on the soil is already on the soil?
Yes.
We have status that we have to achieve by 2015.
That's correct.
Are we going to be able to achieve this status?
Well, research conducted in 2011 showed that even if you assume the most rapid possible transport of these chemicals, many Irish locations are unlikely to achieve the first target deadline of 2015. And that study was a very, very simplified study. It didn't take into effect the full complexity of the soil. Actually, in the case of phosphorus, it can take between 7 and 15 years for phosphorus levels to decrease from high to acceptable levels. And obviously, if that's the case in the soil, it has repercussions for the groundwater. So as we can say that the 2015 deadline is largely unachievable, there's been an extension put in place to 2027 based on this research. But in order to better advise policymakers and also the bodies such as the Environmental Protection Agency and the Agricultural Catchments Programme who are monitoring our waters, it's very helpful if we have more site-specific deadlines, and that's where my research comes in. Rather than take a generic approach to the soil, my PhD uses computer simulations of water movement through the soil to estimate the soil component of time lag, and we have another student based at Johnstown Castle who is taking care of the groundwater transit component. And basically my computer program, I measure soil hydraulic characteristics such as how porous it is and how well it conducts water, and I also measure the weather, and I use these as inputs to the computer program, and that generates timescales, time lag values. And I can use these values to advise policymakers or monitoring bodies. So the first part of my PhD was really testing the inputs to the model. And as you would possibly expect, but surprisingly people had done little research on it, the better you describe the soil to the model, the better it performs and the better estimates it can give you. So I was trying to evaluate how much of the soil characteristics you really need to measure. And the second stage of my PhD, which I'm still involved in at the moment, it's very exciting, is improving these methods that we use to measure the characteristics. For many, many years we used old-fashioned equipment called pressure plates, and not to bore you with the details of them, but they essentially were used to measure soil hydraulic properties, but they're very, very slow. You're talking it would take months to get a result. I'm using a high-speed centrifuge to do the very same work, but in a matter of days. This is a major improvement to the method, and we're hoping that we can use it to gather data on far more sites than was previously available. And then finally I'm using field scale tracers, where you apply a chemical and measure its movement through the soil to validate the results I get from my computer simulation. I expect the final results from that component should be coming out next year sometime.
Okay, so if I understand you then, the status of our groundwater, the quality of our groundwater is largely dependent on how quickly these pollutants are being transported through the soil, which is dependent on the soil properties that you are measuring.
Sure.
And on the weather. Now, you said that legislation has recently been extended from 2015 to 2027, I think.
That's correct.
So does that mean the EU legislation is taking this time lag research into consideration?
The EU legislation, when it was first enacted, set up set reporting periods, so 2015, 2021 and 2027. But at the time of its enactment, it gave no acknowledgement of the different hydraulic and meteorological properties, not just across Ireland, but across the EU as a whole. So you have the same time limits in place in Germany or Poland or Sweden or France that you do here in Ireland, which is baffling really when you think about it, because we have such different climates and such vastly different soils. But even if you take into Ireland alone, because of our glacial history, it's completely different. East to west, those soils don't really resemble each other in any meaningful manner. As for the legislation, yes, it does take it into account now, in that we've proven over the course of the last few years that time lag does exist. But initially it was something of a blunt instrument. In fact, time lag was largely dismissed in the non-scientific community. There's a group called the European Environmental Bureau, and in a report they issued, they stated that time lag was a generic excuse to escape penalties, but we can scientifically demonstrate that that is not the case. So I think we're up against three challenges as scientists and stakeholders in water quality. Number one, we need to talk to the policymakers and better inform them of how long it's really going to take, and that it's going to be different in different places. Number two, we need to talk to the general public, the stakeholders, that's you, me and everybody. We all use water, and we need to understand how long it takes, what's involved in improving it, and also what are the scientific principles behind these. You know, so often I listen to the news and I hear values or legislation come in and I don't really know where it comes from a lot. So I think as part of my project, I'd definitely like to put a lot of effort, not into just talking to the policymakers, but into talking to everybody else as well. And finally, we need to talk to the farmers, because they're the ones in Ireland who are implementing a lot of these measures. And we need to reassure them in a lot of ways that we are taking into account the challenges that they're up against, and trying to better characterise those so we can make better legislation and consequently better policies. I'm not against the legislation in any way, but it needs to be tailored and site-specific so that it can be meaningful and have a real effect.
Is there something on a personal level that individuals should be made aware of? To some extent, a lot of what we put into our gardens, maybe a lot of what we are putting down our drains, depending on how our water treatment processes are done within our individual communities, might be ending up in the ground. Is that true?
That is absolutely very true. Now, luckily, we have we don't have a particularly intense population in Ireland, in that it's not vastly concentrated. You don't have millions and millions in a very small area. So actually our groundwater is not at a very major threat from our day-to-day processes. But as a matter of course, everything you put into the water has to be taken out, either by the soil or by chemical cleaning in plants. So yeah, as a rule of thumb, it's always good to limit what you put down your drain. One thing I would say you have to be very aware of is septic tanks. There's actually a lot of work being done in Trinity College on this, using actually the very same approach I'm using for an agricultural system, because septic tanks are a major source of point pollution when they're damaged. So certainly in some areas that would be something you'd have to be very aware of. Always get your septic tanks maintained.
Okay, so you talked about the fact that this time lag factor is considered on an EU level, but at the moment one number is given for the entire EU and doesn't consider the huge diversity of soils and weather patterns that we have across the EU. Mm-hmm. So certainly something more specific is needed for Ireland, but can you tell us from your research so far on an Irish scale how much of a breakdown do we need?
Well, it's very interesting. It depends who you are. So for the monitoring, this is the first part of my research, was testing the sensitivity of the model to various soil input data. And we actually have a vast amount of soils data in Ireland due to the fantastic work done by the Irish Soils Information Study, which was largely based at Teagasc Johnstown Castle, but it was also in association with various universities and PhD students, the Agricultural Catchments Programme. It was really a huge collaborative effort. And what the Irish soil system did was they undertook a massive mapping campaign across the whole of Ireland. They have now produced online soils maps. In fact, anyone can go onto their website and view soils maps for Ireland in great detail. It's a phenomenal resource. And what I found was, using this basic soils data that they have provided, I can estimate the initial breakthrough time. So that's the first time the solute touches the groundwater. And this is so useful for monitoring bodies. Based on this data, the EPA or the ACP, I can tell them, or they can, using my model, know when exactly they need to start monitoring and when groundwater contamination starts. However, if you want to know the full duration of time lag, so not when it starts, but when it's likely to end, you need an increase in soils data. So you need to actually measure the properties of specific soils. Because even within a soils group, so if you take a clay loam soil, there's going to be differences between clay loam soils depending on how they've been compacted, what's their wetting and drying history, what's been grown on them. So you need to increase the data complexity. And that's what my lab component now works with, is handling this increase in data complexity and better measuring those properties. But even based on the mapping we have already, we can estimate an awful lot about time lag, and that's really exciting. Because of our glacial history, we have challenges that a lot of other places, say the Midwest in America, doesn't have. Our soils are very stratified and layered. They have a lot of rock intrusions, and they have a real mix of soils. We also have the issue of karst. You see here in the west of Ireland, karst is basically limestone where most of the soil around it has been washed away and disintegrated over years, so it's extremely porous. So you're dealing with very, very rapid travel times here in the west compared to the southeast, where I work on a daily basis. And then in the southwest, you also have plagan soils, and they're soils that have had a lot of man-made interaction over years. So we're dealing with a vast variety of timescales. Time lag can run from a couple of months to many years in some cases, and that's why we need this work. But the Irish Soils Information Survey, I really recommend going onto their website and look at those maps. They are phenomenal, what you can learn from them, and that's the data that I'm working with initially.
Okay. You've given me some indication of what the future holds in relation to this research.
Sure.
Do you see other applications of your work?
There's certainly a lot of applications of the model. I mean, it's been used all over the world. Some people use this same computer model. The model's called Hydrus. They use this model not just to estimate how quickly a contaminant moves, but all sorts of soil water properties. So you can estimate what water is available for plants to use, or you can estimate evaporation. You can even use it to infer strength of the soil. So that's going to be important from an engineering point of view. And the work I did on determining the importance of various model inputs, that's going to have a relevance for any users of the model. And because it's such a popular worldwide model, I would expect a far-reaching implication. We actually published this work in the Journal of Contaminant Hydrology, December issue. So if anyone's interested in reading the scientific paper, I'd recommend that you look it up. In terms of the practical lab work I'm doing, we are improving an existing method, the centrifuge method, for something called the soil water characteristic curve. And this has been a very, very challenging method within the soil physics community. So anyone who's looking to measure these properties, be they in a lab here in Ireland or in the United States, is going to be able to use this. The reason we're using this centrifuge to do this work is because all labs have centrifuges, whereas the traditional equipment are very, very specific, and you'd find a lot of labs. In fact, I don't believe they have the equipment here in NUI Galway, and they certainly don't have it in UCD or Trinity. Just Teagasc happened to have it. So by improving the method and adapting the new centrifuge method, we've developed a technique that it's not just we can use, but anyone can use.
Can you tell me just a little bit about yourself? How did you get into this area of research, and what does the future hold for you?
I actually studied animal and crop production at UCD for my undergrad, but I was always drawn to the soil side of things. I mean, it's so important and it's so underappreciated. We have soil everywhere around us, but we don't ever think of how it works. But it's the foundation of agriculture, and everything starts with it. It's important to us as humans. The word human has the same roots as the word humus, which is the fertile upper layer of the soil. In fact, the name Adam, which we assign to the first man, comes from the Hebrew word Adama, which means earth man. Earth is important to us and we don't appreciate it. So I suppose I'm drawn to it as it's underappreciated, I suppose. Once I finished my undergrad, I did a Master of Science by Research, again with UCD, on soil compaction during slurry spreading. That's the major source of fertilisers in Ireland at the moment. And it was a really fascinating project. Basically, I waited till it rained, and then I drove over the soil with a tractor, and I measured how squashed, how compacted the soil got, and how quickly it recovered. And it was a brilliant project. So I knew I wanted to stay in research, and I wanted to do a PhD with Teagasc. NUI Galway is really leading the way in terms of hydrology, both in the engineering department and the Ryan Institute. So when I heard they were doing this project on soil hydrology and water quality, and it was still in conjunction with Teagasc, I was really, really keen to have a part of it. Although I'm a student with NUI Galway, because I'm based in the field, I spend most of my time in the Environmental Research Centre in Wexford, where we have people there working on all aspects of soil. We have soil physicists, microbiologists, we have mapping people, gaseous emissions people, biology. Really every aspect of soil science is represented there. It's fantastic to sit at the tea table and you go around and everyone has a different view or something to add to the conversation. So that's a great place to work as well. One of the things I found great with being part of the NUI Galway and the Ryan Institute is it's given me an opportunity to speak to people. A lot of the time, scientific researchers, you know, we go into the lab or we go into the field or we sit at our computer and, you know, we work away and we don't really talk to anybody outside of our own research station. Because my work has implications for policy, it's absolutely critical that I talk to people. And it's important that I talk to not just policymakers, but the farmers who are doing the hard work at the field scale and the stakeholders, you know. And the Ryan Institute, because they've run events like the Thresis event, which I then got involved in the national level of Thresis, it's given me an opportunity to talk to the general public. Thresis is a competition in which speakers are invited to describe their PhD research in 3 minutes using only 3 slides to 3 judges. And I suppose the challenge is if you can't describe your work to someone over a cup of tea, do you really understand it at all? So we had a great response from that. I came second in the finals last year, which was fantastic, and I'm competing again. But we've had huge response all over the country. The AECOM Young Environmental Science Award was given to us in February, which was a huge award, very prestigious. They're a group of engineers and they'd be very, very familiar with hydraulics and the issues we're dealing with. So that was a huge boost to get. And then the Irish Geological Society and the International Association of Hydrologists sponsored me to go over to America 2 weeks ago to attend the ASA, CSSA, SSSA annual meeting in Long Beach, California, where I presented literally all of my work. I think I did 4 or 5 presentations in 3 days. But it was a phenomenal opportunity to get the message out and to explain what we're doing here at NUI Galway and Teagasc. I got to present to people who wrote the textbooks that I study. I was a little awestruck. So it's a phenomenal opportunity to do that, and it really demonstrates the high quality work that NUI Galway, the Ryan Institute and Teagasc are doing, that we can compete and we can stand up with literally anyone in the world. I have 1 year left in my PhD. Well, I hope it's only 1 year anyway to finish everything up, but I definitely want to follow up with more research, and there's so much more to do. I mean, we're only touching on the complexities of soil. We know so little about something that means so much to us. I heard a great quote recently. It said, "The larger the searchlight, the larger the circumference of the unknown." And I think we've pushed out the circumference a little bit, but we've an awful lot more to learn.